The landlord, the lady, and Mr. Charles Wogan were all three, it seemed, in luck's way that September morning of the year 1719. Wogan was not surprised, his luck for the moment was altogether in, so that even when his horse stumbled and went lame at a desolate part of the road from Florence to Bologna, he had no doubt but that somehow fortune would serve him. His horse stepped gingerly on for a few yards, stopped, and looked round at his master. Wogan and his horse were on the best of terms. "Is it so bad as that?" said he, and dismounting he gently felt the strained leg. Then he took the bridle in his hand and walked forward, whistling as he walked. Yet the place and the hour were most unlikely to give him succor. It was early morning, and he walked across an empty basin of the hills. The sun was not visible, though the upper air was golden and the green peaks of the hills rosy. The basin itself was filled with a broad uncolored light, and lay naked to it and extraordinarily still. There were as yet no shadows, the road rose and dipped across low, page 2, ridges of turf, a ribbon of dead and unillumined white, and the grass at any distance from the road had the darkness of peat. He led his horse forward for perhaps a mile, and then turning a corner by a knot of trees came unexpectedly upon a wayside inn. In front of the inn stood a traveling carriage with its team of horses. The backs of the horses smoked, and the candles of the lamps were still burning in the broad daylight. Mr. Wogan quickened his pace. He would beg a seat on the box to the next posting stage. Fortune had served him. As he came near he heard from the interior of the inn a woman's voice, not unmusical so much as shrill with impatience, which perpetually ordered and protested. As he came nearer he heard a man's voice obsequiously answering the protests, and as the sound of his footsteps rang in front of the inn both voices immediately stopped. The door was flung hastily open, and the landlord and the lady ran out onto the road. "Sir," said the lady in Italian, "I need a postilion." To Wogan's thinking she needed much more than a postilion. She needed certainly a retinue of servants. He was not quite sure that she did not need a nurse, for she was a creature of an exquisite fragility, with the pouting face of a child, and the childishness was exaggerated by a great muslin bow she wore at her throat. Her pale hair, where it showed beneath her hood, was fine as silk and as glossy, her eyes had the color of an Italian sky, page 3, at noon, and her cheeks the delicate tinge of a carnation. The many laces and ribbons, knotted about her dress in a manner most mysterious to Wogan, added to her gossamer appearance, and, in a word, she seemed to him something too flower-like for the world's rough usage. "I must have a postilion," she continued. "Presently, madam," said the landlord, smiling with all a Tuscan peasant's desire to please. "In a minute. In less than a minute." He looked complacently about him as though at any moment now a crop of postilions might be expected to flower by the roadside. The lady turned from him with a stamp of the foot and saw that Wogan was curiously regarding her carriage. A boy stood at the horses' heads, but his dress and sleepy face showed that he had not been half an hour out of bed, and there was no one else. Wogan was wondering how in the world she had traveled as far as this inn. The lady explained. "The postilion who drove me from Florence was drunk, oh, but drunk. He rolled off his horse just here, opposite the door. See, I beat him," and she raised the beribboned handle of a toy-like cane. "But it was no use. I broke my cane over his back, but he would not get up. He crawled into the passage where he lies." Wogan had some ado not to smile. Neither the cane nor the hand which wielded it would be likely to interfere even with a sober man's slumbers. "And I must reach Bologna today," she cried, page 4, in an extreme agitation. "It is of the last importance." "Fortune is kind to us both, madam," said Wogan, with a bow. "My horse is lamed, as you see. I will be your charioteer, for I too am in a desperate hurry to reach Bologna." Immediately the lady drew back. "Oh," she said with a start, looking at Wogan. Wogan looked at her. "Ah," said he, thoughtfully. They eyed each other for a moment, each silently speculating what the other was doing alone at this hour and in such a haste to reach Bologna. "You are English," she said with a great deal of unconcern, and she asked in English. That she was English, Wogan already knew from her accent. His Italian, however, was more than passable, and he was a wary man by nature as well as by some 10 years' training in a service where wariness was the first need, though it was seldom acquired. He could have answered no quite truthfully, being Irish. He preferred to answer her in Italian as though he had not understood. "I beg your pardon. Yes, I will drive you to Bologna if the landlord will swear to look after my horse." And he was very precise in his directions. The landlord swore very readily. His anxiety to be rid of his vociferous guest and to get back to bed was extreme. Wogan climbed into the postillion's saddle, describing the while such, page 5, remedies as he desired to be applied to the sprained leg. "The horse is a favorite?" asked the lady. "Madam," said Wogan, with a laugh, "I would not lose that horse for all the world, for the woman I shall marry will ride on it into my city of dreams." The lady stared, as she well might. She hesitated with her foot upon the step. "Is he sober?" she asked of the landlord. "Madam," said the landlord, unabashed, "in this district he is nicknamed the water drinker." "You know him, then? He is Italian?" "He is more. He is of Tuscany." The landlord had never seen Wogan in his life before, but the lady seemed to wish some assurance on the point, so he gave it. He shut the carriage door, and Wogan cracked his whip. The postillion's desires were of a piece with the lady's. They raced across the valley, and as they climbed the slope beyond, the sun came over the crests. One moment the dew upon the grass was like raindrops, the next it shone like polished jewels. The postilion shouted a welcome to the sun, and the lady proceeded to breakfast in her carriage. Wogan had to snatch a meal as best he could while the horses were changed at the posting stage. The lady would not wait, and Wogan for his part was used to a light fare. He drove into Bologna that afternoon. The lady put her head from the window and, page 6, called out the name of a street. Her postilion, however, paid no heed. He seemed suddenly to have grown deaf. He whipped up his horses, shouted encouragements to them and warnings to the pedestrians on the roads. The carriage rocked round corners and bounced over the uneven stones. Wogan had clean forgotten the fragility of the traveler within. He saw men going busily about, talking in groups and standing alone, and all with consternation upon their faces. The quiet streets were alive with them. Something had happened that day in Bologna, some catastrophe. Or news had come that day, bad news. Wogan did not stop to inquire. He drove at a gallop straight to a long white house which fronted the street. The green latticed shutters were closed against the sun, but there were servants about the doorway, and in their aspect, too, there was something of disorder. Wogan called to one of them, jumped down from his saddle, and ran through the open doorway into a great hall with frescoed walls all ruined by neglect. At the back of the hall a marble staircase, guarded by a pair of marble lions, ran up to a landing and divided. Wogan set foot on the staircase and heard an exclamation of surprise. He looked up. A burly, good-humored man in the gay embroideries of a courtier was descending towards him. "You!" cried the courtier. "Already," and then laughed. He was the only man whom Wogan had seen laugh since he drove into Bologna, and he drew a great breath of hope. Page 7. Then nothing has happened, Whittington? There is no bad news? There is news so bad, my friend, that you might have jogged here on a mule and still have lost no time. Your hurry is clean wasted, answered Whittington. Wogan ran past him up the stairs, and so left the hall and the open doorway clear. Whittington looked now straight through the doorway, and saw the carriage and the lady on the point of stepping down onto the curb. His face assumed a look of extreme surprise. Then he glanced up the staircase after Wogan and laughed as though the conjunction of the lady and Mr. Wogan was a rare piece of amusement. Mr. Wogan did not hear the laugh, but the lady did. She raised her head, and at the same moment the courtier came across the hall to meet her. As soon as he had come close, "Harry," said she, and gave him her hand. He bent over it and kissed it, and there was more than courtesy in the warmth of the kiss. "But I'm glad you've come. I did not look for you for another week," he said in a low voice. He did not, however, offer to help her to alight. "This is your lodging?" she asked. "No," said he, "the King's," and the woman shrank suddenly back amongst her cushions. In a moment, however, her face was again at the door. "Then who was he, my postilion?" Page 8. "Your postilion?" asked Whittington, glancing at the servant who held the horses. "Yes, the tall man who looked as if he should have been a scholar and had twisted himself all awry into a soldier. You must have passed him in the hall." Whittington stared at her. Then he burst again into a laugh. "Your postilion, was he? That's the oddest thing," and he lowered his voice. "Your postilion was Mr. Charles Wogan, who comes from Rome post-haste with the Pope's procuration for the marriage. You have helped him on his way, it seems. Here's a good beginning, to be sure." The lady uttered a little cry of anger, and her face hardened out of all its softness. She clenched her fists viciously, and her blue eyes grew cold and dangerous as steel. At this moment she hardly looked the delicate flower she had appeared to Wogan's fancy. "But you need not blame yourself," said Whittington, and he lowered his head to a level with hers. "All the procurations in Christendom will not marry Jane Stuart to Clementina Sobieski." "She has not come, then?" "No, nor will she come. There is news today. Lean back from the window, and I will tell you. She has been arrested at Innsbruck." The lady could not repress a crow of delight. "Hush," said Whittington. Then he withdrew his head and resumed in his ordinary voice, "I, page 9, have hired a house for your ladyship, which I trust will be found convenient. My servant will drive you thither." He summoned his servant from the group of footmen about the entrance, gave him his orders, bowed to the ground, and twisting his cane sauntered idly down the street. Page 10.